All right, folks. Welcome to the International Law Show. Tonight we're speaking with Liam, an international law student with a few ideas on environmental law in the modern age. Welcome, Liam.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
So tell me, Liam, what is it about environmental law that you'd like to speak to us today?
Well, I'm actually here to propose a solution that I see an issue in the structure of international environmental law. Despite the growing presence of individuals and groups in public policy making and environmental politics, when it comes to environmental law, it's still very much defined in terms of the nation state, just like many other types of international law. And as a global lawyer, I'm in a position to criticize this framework as it's incapable and inadequate, to address particular areas of increasing global concern.
And one of those areas is environmental law?
Yeah, absolutely. Among a number of other issues, including international criminal law and human rights violations, it's fundamentally the nation-state primacy in international law is incompatible with multilateral action. And the main reason for that is that public policy is created within nation-states. And they're subject to a whole range of political and legal forces evolved over time. One of the main issues for politicians is re-election or control of power. And say, take Australia, for example, we've got 3-year terms of government. Realistically, how much influence and effect is one government's environmental policy going to have on multi-decade, multi-century environmental concerns? And additionally, governments are accountable to business interests as powerful constituents.
You could also say, sorry to cut you off, but you could also say that they're at the mercy of business interests?
Yeah, absolutely. I would agree with that. And the geopolitical framework is, particularly in the advent of the successful spread of capitalism over the last century or so, has positioned business interests to be of more concern to politicians than, say, environmental aspects.
Well, a good economy is a good government, right?
Well, in some ways, I agree with you. But in many others, that does little for multilateral cooperation on international environmental law, especially when businesses have competing obligations to shareholders.
Why now, though? The issue of national public policy has been around for years as a barrier to international collective action.
Well, the digital age is having a pervasive effect on society. And as global lawyers, we need to harness this at local, national, and supranational levels. There's technologies that can reconnect people to the natural and physical environment, raise consciousness about particular environmental problems, and even lobby for personal and political change. Gillian Young suggests, and I quote, "This shift demonstrates that one of the ways in which law about the physical environment now works is through the socio-spatial sphere of virtual networks." And traditional mass media is still very state-centered and frames national debates and environment within the sphere of nationally politically framed debates.
Like the ongoing debate in particular in the United States between proponents and skeptics of climate change?
Absolutely. There's more time being spent on debates than real environmental law adoption. And global environmental lawyers, in some respects, have already begun to harness the power of these virtual technologies, at local, national, regional, even global levels. And environmental activism is able to alert people to the influence that they're having in their own back gardens. I'm sure you've heard of the slogan, "Think globally, act locally."
Yes, I have. Yes, definitely.
Well, it's the development of these communication technologies that have allowed us to regard ourselves as members of communities much larger and geographically more expansive than ever before. And these same technologies that deepen our connection to local environments by observing our own impact and helping us there, they're also the same technologies that enable individuals to identify with much larger spaces and issues, cross-border. And from a legal perspective, this is very powerful. Nation states are always going to represent constituents politically in the international sphere, but global lawyers and NGOs should be the ones to represent constituents legally, and we can act as mediators when it comes time for particular environmental crises. And it's about recognizing the inherent incompatibility of multilateral environmental action and then why we should be leaving it up to the responsibility of nation states. Global lawyers are best positioned to frame a global policy towards international law, including the growth in the digital age and also with recognition of certain cultural competencies, understanding that different communities and different people around the world have a completely different connection to land and nature.
Look, global public policy seems like a good idea in theory, but how is environmental law any different to a global policy on other issues like trade, women's rights, indigenous rights, the rest of it?
Well, if you think there's a global policy on women's rights now, I think you're having a laugh, But, I'd see what you're saying. I'm a globalist at heart, and it takes me to another more fundamental issue, and that's really why is it that the subject status in international law is reserved for nation states. The same people, the same nation states that are the sole governors and drafters of international law are the ones that are seeking to be bound by it. And us as global lawyers are positioned to to want to change this, and we need to expand the subject status of international environmental law to not only nation states but transnational corporations, non-governmental organizations, and also citizens. The way it's set up currently is mostly governed by multilateral environmental agreements, and whilst these do set some standards for states, they only indirectly create governing implications for transnational corporations and NGOs. And we might have seen some examples where transnational corporations have been held accountable for their impact on the environment, say for instance through pollution and stuff. But these are usually done through treaties, international treaties. And again, this relies on domestic implementation, and furthermore just enhances the nation-state primacy in international law. And we've already said that this doesn't work. Any real moves towards transnational corporations becoming subjects as international law would most likely further reduce complications in the future, particularly to do with responsibility on sustainability and environmental action. And as digital technologies begin to create an even more influence in particularly developing nations like China and India, as we say, it's the role of global lawyers to manage this interplay between an international legal framework and these nations themselves. And international law, it's a criticism that probably the world's not ready to expand subject status to all bodies of international law. But why don't we just exclusively make it international environmental law and then potentially use that as a model for other multilateral arrangements?
To grow from there, right?
Absolutely. So we need to set up an international organization like the World Environmental Organization. Maybe base it similar to the WTO, which already has some indications that subjectivity status on other participants in international law, such as transnational corporations, may work. But it also needs to be a non-UN subsidiary body, because yes, there are some already environmental UN bodies, but it needs to be separate from the UN so as to reduce geopolitical encroachment. And without getting too much in a geopolitical debate about the UN, it would be the further it's separate from the UN, the more involved global lawyers would need to be to ensure that it's balancing the interests of other supranational bodies like the WTO, like the EU, and it would create a market for global lawyers and their legal problem-solving skills. But more fundamentally, what it would do is it would create issues, it would position issues like international environmental law from a legal perspective rather than just exclusively a geopolitical one.
And how do you think states will specifically react to something like this? How would they respond to an issue like this that you're proposing?
Well, that's really the central issue, particularly where in an era where supranational governance is being treated with more and more suspicion, as we've seen with the rise of nationalist governments being elected across the world. And that's why global lawyers really are best positioned to respond to this, differing of priorities and differing of interests. Global environmental concerns are so fundamental to human existence that global lawyers really need to shape this concept of an international cross-jurisdiction, intergovernmental, interagency body as one of collaboration rather than of forfeiture of power or of sovereignty. And to create an independent body with subject status to not only nation states but transnational corporations, NGOs and citizens would create accountability by providing rights, duties, obligations on all these different divisions of responsibility. And we may even need to set up an international environmental court, which would further separate geopolitical pressures and forces.
Look, I feel like we're potentially a long way away from that, but are you optimistic that something like this could work?
Look, absolutely. I'm thinking big picture here. I think at the end of the day, we've got no choice. The multilateral action on environmental concerns is just simply taking too long, and there's some serious concerns for the way that the environment is heading. And I'm not blaming nation states for this cause or this result or this issue, not at all. Don't get me wrong. They've got some involved geopolitical interests that have just. The reality is that environmental concerns are further down their list of priorities.
Absolutely, yeah.
And an international body separate, an international environmental organization would never be fully separate from geopolitical forces. And I understand that. That's one of the main criticisms of a body like the WTO and even subsidiary bodies of the UN. But the way in which global lawyers approach this task may have a more significant influence in the future if we start positioning these global issues as legal rather than just exclusively geopolitical in nature. It's a real opportunity for global lawyers to stand up, take real responsibility to implement global policy towards environmental law, particularly when digital age information technologies have created unprecedented circumstances to do so.
Look, Liam, I want to thank you for coming on the show tonight. I mean, the show is here for people like you to speak your voice, and you're welcome back anytime, and thanks for coming on board.
Thank you. Appreciate it.